On Sabbath, February 13, 1915, Ellen White was going into her writing room, which was on the second floor of her home in Elmshaven, Northern California. And whether she turned or tripped, we don't know, but she fell. And she cried out in pain. Her niece was in an adjoining room, came running, and found her Aunt Ellen there in pain in the doorway going into her writing room. Her niece, of course, was afraid that her Aunt Ellen, who was 87 by this time, had fallen and broken her hip. And so she tried to help her get a little more comfortable. The niece called for some other people to come. They took Ellen White to the nearby St. Helena Sanitarium, x-rayed the hip, and in fact, it was broken. In those days, they didn't pin hips. And if you were elderly and you fell and broke a hip, it was almost like a death sentence. Pneumonia would eventually set in because you couldn't exercise. And so everyone knew that Ellen White's days, unless God worked a miracle, Ellen White's days were not going to be too many more. You can imagine when the word got around among Seventh-day Adventists that Ellen White had fallen and broken her hip, there was a great deal of concern. There had never been a time before when there was not a living connection between heaven and earth in this church. What would the future be like? What would happen? Willie White, her son, Ellen White's son, knew that Adventists were very concerned and were praying around the world for his mother. And so almost every week from then until her death in July, he would send a little short notice to the Review, and they would print those on the back page of the Review. And you can read through them, and you can see as you read over the next few weeks and months that she's getting weaker and weaker, and in fact, God was going to let her rest. When you come to just a few days before she died, she was talking, this was 2 or 3 days, the day she actually died, she was unconscious by then. But 2 or 3 days before, her son, someone else was there in the room, and she said the last words that she spoke, which were, "I know in whom I have believed." There was no doubt in her mind. She had lived her life in close relationship with Jesus. She knew her salvation in him was secure, and there was no fear about dying. When she actually died on Friday afternoon, July 16, 1915, everyone knew the end was near. Her breathing was not as regular as it had been. Word was sent out to various members of the family and workers that worked there on the place for Ellen White, that if you want to see her before she dies, why, you better come now. And so they gathered in her writing room upstairs, which is where she had been since her accident. They'd put a hospital bed in there, and that's where she was. And they gathered around her. As I said, she was unconscious by then. Talking to someone that was there that day, they said that when the end came, she would inhale and then exhale and then inhale, but it was getting less and less frequent. Ellen White's second oldest granddaughter, who was a very warm and loving person, sat there next to her grandmother's bed, holding her grandmother's hand. Somewhere, Mabel, that was the granddaughter's name, Mabel had heard that occasionally a person just before they die, though they have been unconscious, may come to life, or come to consciousness again. And if her grandmother became conscious, she wanted to make certain her grandmother knew someone was holding her hand. But the person that was there that told me said that when the end finally came, there was no struggle. It was just like a candle burning itself out, and finally the last poof, the last little bit of smoke from the candle. For 70 years, Ellen White had been the Lord's messenger. For 70 years, she had brought messages of hope and instruction and encouragement to this church. And for 70 years, she had walked in a relationship with Jesus so that, as I just said, her last words a few days earlier could be with confidence, "I know in whom I have believed."